Since it's 9 o'clock, I am going to show a brief video and then we'll get started.
Our township wetlands are very important. They help with a lot of factors in our environment. So when we get heavy rains and we get flooding, the wetlands will actually store the water and they'll hold on to it until we have a drought, and then they'll slowly release it. They also filter pollutants out of our water that runs into the wetlands, and so they make it cleaner. We can think of them as the kidneys of the land. And they are also home to a ton of wildlife and plants. And actually in Michigan, 49% of our rare plants in Michigan depend on wetlands. There's a lot of great ways that residents can help protect wetlands. The number one thing is becoming educated, not disturbing the wetland, not using pesticide or chemicals around it, and planting native species in your yard, also getting involved in township programs. The Meridian Conservation Corps does a lot of work removing invasive species, which are a huge threat to wetlands. Every wetland has to have a 20-foot buffer of natural vegetation. So when we're thinking about wetlands, I just want residents to keep in mind the usefulness that they provide to us. And I think a lot of us think of mosquitoes when we think of wetlands, and we often think they create the mosquito problem. But if we just really helped to conserve these areas and brought back their balance, we would find that the mosquito populations would actually decrease, because when we take care of these spaces, we're allowing animals to come in that feed on mosquitoes. As long as we're taking care of these areas, that's not going to be an issue.
Thank you, Emma. I am going to just welcome everybody to the dialogue today, and I'm going to briefly introduce Kendra Grzeski, who will introduce our speaker, and then we'll open it up for dialogue. Kendra is on the Land Preservation Advisory Board, as well as our Environmental Commission and other things. If you want to add anything to that, Kendra, feel free. But I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you, Leroy. Good morning, everyone, and happy World Wetland Day. Welcome to the kickoff of our year-long wetland education and outreach initiative. I am Kendra Grzeski, and I am leading the effort to help protect our wetlands from Meridian Township Environmental Commission. I want to start by thanking the Board of Trustees who made this part of their 2022 climate sustainability goals. Particularly thank you to the leadership of Trustee Courtney Winzinski, who has championed this initiative. Thank you also to Leroy Harvey, Emma Campbell, Brady Yates, and Paige Elise, who also serve on our wetland study group. Finally, thank you to all my fellow environmental commissioners, Land Preservation Advisory Board members, Meridian Conservation Corps members, Green Dialogue colleagues, and to all of you for joining us today. As part of this initiative and to celebrate World Wetland Day, I would like to welcome the Meridian Township Wetland Consultant, Elise Tripp. Elise is a professional wetland scientist, as certified by the Society of Wetland Scientists, and a senior wetland scientist at Fishbach in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She holds a BS degree in biology from Wheaton College, MS in soil science from University of California, Davis, and an MA in environmental design from Michigan State University. Elise has provided wetland consulting services for 24 years, including wetland delineation, permitting, mitigation, design, and monitoring. Her other responsibilities include sustainable landscape design, natural features assessment, and threatened and endangered species evaluations. She has served as a Meridian Township consultant since 2009, providing regulatory oversight for the Meridian Township Wetland Ordinance. And with that, I'd like to welcome Elise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure to serve Meridian Township over the last, well, since 2009, whatever the math works out to. I realized in your intro there was one little error. I've actually provided wetland services, wetland consulting for 34 years, not 24 years. So I'm older than you may originally have thought. So I have prepared some thoughts of what I can share with you today. I thought you probably mostly are somewhat familiar with the Township Wetland Ordinance, but I thought I'd give you a very quick overview of how it differs from state law, and then give you a glimpse into what I do as the consultant for Meridian Township, what services I provide, just so you can understand like how the program works and what we do, how we preserve wetlands within the township. So the wetland ordinance is the state allows townships and cities to have more strict regulation of wetlands than the state law provides. So basically, you are able to regulate wetlands that are smaller, isolated wetlands that are smaller than what are regulated under state law. So state law regulates all wetlands contiguous to a water feature and isolated wetlands that are 5 acres or larger. Meridian's wetland law ordinance protects wetlands that are 2 acres or larger, and wetlands between 1/4 acre and 2 acres are also protected if they provide natural functions. So the other thing that is unique in the ordinance is that it has that buffer requirement that no development, no development like with buildings is allowed within 40 feet of a wetland, and the 20 feet next to the wetland has to be maintained in native or natural vegetation. But you can have lawn from 20 to 40 feet out. And there is a no wetland loss policy. So if development it is not avoidable to impact wetlands, then the developer has to mitigate for that wetland loss, which means to create some new wetland, which is typically on the site that is being developed. So I'm looking down because I got my little outline here, so I stay on track. As the wetland consultant for the township, I report directly to the Director of Community Planning and Development. So that's Tim Schmidt now. It was Mark Kisselbach for many years. And the thing I do the most for the township is I delineate wetland boundaries. I figure out where is that wetland boundary, or I confirm the boundaries that other consultants have flagged. That delineating a wetland boundary is a very technical activity. It's dictated by a manual. We have to look at soils, vegetation, and hydrology, collect data on sample data forms, and confirm that all 3 characteristics are there: dominant wetland vegetation, wetland hydrology, and wetland soil. So at sample points, we collect, we estimate the percent cover of the herbaceous plants, the shrubs, and the trees, and the vines out to different buffers. So 5 feet for the herbaceous, 15 feet for shrubs, and 30 feet out for trees and vines. And each species has a wetland indicator status. So the wetland statuses are, so the different statuses are obligate wetland, facultative upland, or upland. And if most of the cover is from the obligate, facultative wetland, and facultative species, then it's considered dominant wetland vegetation. For soils, we dig a hole and we look at the soils and see what color they are, how much organic material there is. Is it muck or is it a mineral soil? And then we determine if the soil meets one of the 18 hydric soil indicators. So there's 18 different ways a soil can be classified as wetland, and we determine that. So it's very technical. Then the third thing is the hydrology. In the hole, we look to see if we hit water. And we also look above ground. There's a variety of indicators of hydrology that you see above ground, like drift patterns, watermarks on trees, that type of thing. So there's 18 primary wetland hydrology indicators and 11 secondary indicators. So it's all based in science, it's all very technical, and it's not a capricious thing that someone goes out there and says this feels like a wetland. Where we run into trouble is kind of at that wetland boundary, because you have your obvious wetlands, cattail marsh or whatever. And as you go upland, you get into shrubs and trees, and that's where you really need a qualified person to read the landscape and determine where exactly does it transition from wetland to upland. Okay, so I delineate wetland boundaries, and then if wetland impacts can't be avoided, the developer will apply for a wetland use permit, and that application's forwarded to me, and I review it, and I provide comments to the township. And if it's acceptable, the township then writes the permit, the wetland use permit. And if part of that would be also a wetland mitigation plan to compensate for any wetland losses. I would review those plans too and provide comments. And then after the mitigation area is constructed, the developer is required to inspect the mitigation for 5 years and submit a annual report to the township. I review those. I go out and I inspect mitigation wetlands to confirm that they are actually turning into wetland. And if everything goes well, after 5 years, we release them from the permit, and they don't need to do any further monitoring because they have compensated for their wetland loss. And then, problems crop up all the time, and we work with the developer, the permittee, to try and resolve those, try to improve the situation. Sometimes on occasion, they have to redo the whole thing. It just did not work as designed. It can get very expensive. Another type of report I write is called a letter of essentiality, and that is a review for wetlands that are between 1/4 acre and 2 acres to officially determine if they provide wetland functions and therefore are regulated under the wetland ordinance. And to be honest, most of the time they are. There's 10 different criteria for evaluating the wetland function, and they're typically related to stormwater or habitat or groundwater treatment, like management, that type of thing. So, but it's a formal process to evaluate that. And so I create the letter of essentiality and give it to the township with my recommendation of if should that smaller wetland be regulated or not. Let's see here. And then occasionally there's just oddball situations that pop up that Tim or Mark would contact me and ask me to meet with somebody, look at their site, assess what's going on, maybe a violation, maybe a neighbor dispute. And I'm kind of the independent set of eyes to go out there and analyze what I see as far as any potential wetland impact that might be a violation. That's not a super common thing that I do, but I do it on occasion. And then every once in a while, I get called in, like the engineering department or Parks and Rec call me, and they need assistance with one of their projects as far as delineating wetlands or, some permitting, that type of thing. So that's it in a nutshell. I have no idea how long that took to fly through. I know it was fast. I think I hit all my main points. So I guess, yeah, we have lots of time for discussion and questions and dialogue.
That was fantastic, Elise. What a nice, concise description.
I could talk about this stuff for hours. So I'm not sure exactly, what are your interests and the hot topics that you'd like to spend a little time on.
As Bill is providing a shining example here, if you've got a question for Elise or the group, raise your hand and I'll hand it over to Bill.
Great, thanks for that overview. It's always good to be reminded of how the whole thing works. A couple of comments and then questions for that we might choose to talk about. The issue of whether a wetland impact can be avoided is one that I don't believe you get involved with as a consultant. That's a determination that's made in the township, but it's one that we struggle with on the Environmental Commission because there's a cost to designing a project. And once a site plan is developed that involves a wetland impact, then there's an incentive on the applicant's part to move forward with that plan rather than something else that might avoid a wetland impact. And the ordinance requires the township to accept that no feasible and prudent alternative exists to the application that's being made. And we rarely get satisfactory evidence that the applicant has really looked for alternatives and has determined that they are not feasible or prudent. So that's more a commentary on how we as a township enforce our own ordinance. The big picture question I'd like to grapple with a bit today is we have a no net loss policy, as you said, and a bunch of us are curious how we would get to a net gain policy. How could we regulate wetlands in a way or manage development in a way that actually took us back towards increasing the total stock of wetlands? And one of the things that's always surprises me is that once a wetland has been converted, in other words, once the vegetation is removed and turf is placed, that area no longer meets the criteria because it doesn't have typical wetland vegetation in it. So it's kind of a grandfathering process. Once you make that impact, you've now disqualified that area from being a regulated wetland. So it seems like there are lots of places that would be had they not been altered. And those are places, I think, where we're interested in seeing if we can regain wetland function. And finally, I remember we asked you many years ago how often the wetland mitigation was being successful. And you just said that there's some instances where it doesn't succeed and has to be redone. But if I recall correctly, you told us that you didn't remember a case where the 5-year bond on the wetland mitigation was not released, that eventually every application for wetland mitigation in the township had become successful. So those are some things I just wanted to put on the table and look forward to talking more.
Oh, okay. Let me give a few initial thoughts. And I may remind me if I start forgetting some of the questions. So when we require mitigation, we follow the state kind of approach to mitigation where say you, now typically you wouldn't have a whole acre impacted, but if you had a whole acre impacted, then you would require for emergent and scrub shrub wetlands replacement or creation of an acre and a half. So you always require that more wetland be constructed than what was impacted. And the idea behind that is that then if some of it fails, at least you got your acre back. The reality is if it's designed well, you actually have gotten a wetland gain at that point. So it is kind of built into the system that it's potential or even likely that you will have a net gain rather than a net loss or just a no loss. So to take it further than that, that gets into, that's a huge, you'd have to rewrite your wetland ordinance. And I would imagine that would be quite a undertaking because the wetland ordinance has to be approved by the state. And so I've never heard of anyone redoing that. Or maybe it could be I'm just kind of talking off the top of my head here. Maybe I don't know if you could have another standalone ordinance, to that effect or not. So the one thing you could do completely separate from the wetland ordinance is to create some kinds of incentives for property owners. And I know the federal, I'm not an expert in that, but I know like there are federal programs for converting former wetlands back to wetlands. Could be tax breaks, you know, could be, you know, that would be something a little bit out of my area of expertise, but it definitely in a place like Meridian Township that has so many wetlands and so many historic wetlands, that you could pursue that that kind of carrot rather than the stick of the ordinance. So okay, so that's about all I can think of at the moment on that. There was something else. Oh, about the success of your mitigation areas. Now, at this point, I mean, you know, probably it's been a few years since we talked about this previously. I mean, I can think of one instance right now where we did not release a bond. The permittee had to rebuild half of their mitigation area. They still have one more year of monitoring to go. They want their bond back, and we're like, well, no. Well, actually, last year should have been the last year of monitoring. We're waiting on that last report. I need to do one more inspection. So, I mean, we have held people to the fire here, saying we won't give you your bond back. So, and then I should probably mention too, the separate from the bond, there is an escrow that the developer has to provide, which pays for me to do my job. So the cost of this program is covered quite a bit by the actual developers who are wanting to do things in the township. Just thought that's probably an interesting point that you should know, that it's not purely funded. And I'm not an expert on how the whole thing's funded. I think there is maybe some money for just my other consulting that I do, but the vast majority of my work is funded by the people who need permits or need delineations.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's get a couple more questions here. I think you can see the order. I know that you could probably write a book on Bill's questions, but let's get the conversation going here. John, I think you're up, and then Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Elise, for that great summary. That was very helpful to me. A couple of questions for you. One is, you know, if there's never standing water in a wetland, can it still be a wetland? That's the first question. Second question is that, you know, with developers, you know, if they do a good job with mitigation and the kind of the vegetation, is it pretty hard then for invasive species to get in there, or is it just kind of a continuing battle?
Oh gosh. Okay, those are good questions. Okay, first question. The definition, kind of the formal definition of a wetland is that there's water present enough so that dominant wetland vegetation is present. Okay, so it doesn't have to be above the ground surface. It just needs to be within the surface foot during a significant portion of the growing season. So, and that's the point where people get really confused, because, you know, they can see where it's flooded down there at the bottom, but then as you start, you know, if it's a very gradual grade coming up, there's this edge area that's kind of the gray zone, and that's where the professional can really see, you know, they know the plants, and they can kind of see where there's a transition from wetland vegetation to upland vegetation. But definitely that's where it can get contentious, because people just don't see the water, so they don't think it's wetland, but it actually may be to a certain point. Okay, no, see, I already forgot the second question, but what was that again? Remind me.
Well, about if the developer does mitigation properly, the invasive species.
Yeah. So invasive species is just this thing that we deal with constantly. So when you're doing a restoration, the first 2 to 3 years are just so critical. If you can control the invasives during, especially the first 2 years, you're probably in pretty good shape as far as attaining kind of a steady state of a good quality native plant community. Now, that's assuming your restoration area, your mitigation area isn't smack dab right next to a solid wall of purple loosestrife. The one that's, well, there's a couple things, a couple plants that are just very common in the township. One is reed canary grass, and that is kind of hard to control. And once it gets in, it takes a ton of herbicide over multiple years to get it under control. And if it's coming in from right next to it, you may just never get it under control. And then the Phragmites is also common. That tends it can come in with rhizomes, and so you really have to get the entire colony. But it is possible to get that under control if you can treat the entire colony, which may go out further than your site. So it's a battle. It's not a hopeless battle, but it can be very difficult. Oh, and I thought of one other, from going back to one of the things Bill asked about with vegetation, planting upland plants in wetlands. If it still has the wetland hydrology, the wetland plants will still want to grow in there. And those can be very tricky situations for me when I go out and look for the wetland boundary, because I may be on someone's mowed lawn and they're mowing into the wetland. And so what I do is I just zero in on what else is growing here with the grass. And like there's moneywort, there's certain small plants that I can identify even if they're being mowed. And then I'll see how squishy it is, and I'll just kind of bump it back. So I do delineate into people's lawns, which they don't necessarily appreciate, but you can see that actually is wetland, even though they're really trying hard to grow grass in it. So anyway, okay. Next
Sarah?
question.
Hello, hi, thank you so much. So I am in charge of my neighborhood pond, and I have the belief that it is a wetland, and next to it is a wetland. I'm interested in this letter of essentiality that you're speaking of. Is that the kind of thing that, how does that work? Like, would that be the kind of thing that I would contact the township to have you come? There's a drain that it's connected to the township drainage system. So is that the kind of thing where the township would have you come out and look to create a letter of essentiality for that, or how does that work?
You may not need a letter of essentiality for that. Do you know how big the pond is offhand? Is it bigger than it? Do you have open water more than an acre?
No, it's not an acre. It's not an acre.
So, but if it's within 500 feet of a stream, which is and open county drain would qualify as a stream, then it's going to be regulated. That's under the state law too. So if it's contiguous, and contiguous is defined as anything from right to the edge out 500 feet. So a lot of that that could be figured out just through a desktop review. And then I should also differentiate between a pond and a wetland. That can be kind of a tricky thing. Normally we think of wetlands, they're vegetated, and that the depth of water, it can be the outer limit is a wetland can go to 6 feet of standing water. I don't know. So it's not super in concrete, but definitely if there's 3 feet of standing water with vegetation in it there, that's a submergent wetland. And it could even be up to 6 feet of water. So sometimes people think they have ponds, but actually it's technically a wetland.
Well, I went out and measured it in a kayak and it's 8 feet at the deepest.
Oh, okay. So the 8 feet, then that deepest part would be considered pond. And then that outer edge, it was likely wetland. So
Okay.
they tend, these things are in complexes, you get both.
Okay,
So
thank you.
8 feet, that's too deep for wetland. But once you get to 6 feet or so, and then shallower, that would be the wetland part of it.
Does it mean anything that it's next to a wetland?
It may just all be part of the same wetland complex.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think Emma's up. If you're done with that question, Sarah, about when a letter of essentiality is required or called in.
Yeah, so that would just be for isolated wetlands that aren't contiguous with a stream or a lake or a pond. And they're between a 1/4 acre and 2 acres. That's when the letter is required. And we would only go through that process if there's some proposed activity. Typically, that's the only time I've ever done it,
Thank you.
like some proposed impact to the wetland.
I think Emma's up now.
So are you going through the chat? I just pulled up the chat. Or you have.
Yeah, Emma has something. I think she's up here. Emma, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Elise. That was awesome. I was typing so fast. That was just so informative. And I just think these are just great conversations as a township employee myself over at the Parks and Rec. These are processes that are so important for everyone to know, and our staff too. And so it's just great to get that whole overview. So, me and several others that were mentioned earlier have been working on getting, more wetland education in the township, these things that we're talking about here. And something we are interested in doing is working with residents to restore their buffers. We know we have that ordinance, but also, like you were saying, kind of shedding light on with ordinances is that we have these things in place, but they still do continue to be violated in some cases. And so we're trying to work on more of a relationship side of things, where we're doing more education and helping residents understand what a buffer is. So something that, when I'm thinking about trying to, there's a wetland on Okemos Road. I don't know, you might be able to picture it in your head. So it's right across from the boardwalk, and there's a property there that their lawn goes right up to the edge of the wetland. So there's no natural buffer there, and it's one that has high visibility. We really want to use that as a starting project. What are some of the difficulties that you could see, or maybe something we need to be thinking about when we're trying to help this neighbor delineate where that buffer is? So are you the one that's going to be called for those instances in the township? And and do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, so I have been in this situation before where there was a buffer issue, and I went out and I put some flags to show them, okay, here's your wetland boundary. And I have a big 100-foot or 50-foot tape. We physically taped back 20 feet, and we put in some stakes so they could visualize. And I learned through that experience, for the average person, especially even if they like to garden, them understanding, like, well, what are the appropriate plants? Where do I get how do I do this restoration? It's really it's a kind of special type of gardening, really, and there's a lot of ways to not do it as well as you could. I mean, if you were to really go into this full-blown wanting to just go in there and do a big conversion, I mean, I would think you would want to herbicide what's there, get it dead, and then plant plugs, plant seed, and then make sure it does get enough water, even though it's wetland, or no, actually the buffer's not wetland, but yeah, you need enough water for the seed to germinate, And I probably, you know, if you're doing a public education campaign, I think, yeah, having a visible kind of example situation to pique interest would be great with some signage. And then, you know, I think they like offer some classes and kind of say, you know, here's grow your buffer,
Yep.
create habitat for the birds and, improve wetland health and really kind of lay out the how-to of doing it would be immensely helpful. When you do this, when you like nature and plants and it's your hobby already, you kind of forget that there's just so much ignorance just about everything related to the natural world and even how it operates. I'm always, I don't know, when I get out of my bubble, I'm always kind of shocked that, wow, it's such a huge learning curve for people. Even though if they have interest, they just don't even know where to start. So, yeah, I think.
Right. So building that connection to, yeah, well, and that's something too, even just having people learning how to botanize, learning plant names. I always say getting friendly with them so that you can build a relationship.
Yeah.
Because, if you know more about something, you're going to love it and care for it. Those
Yeah.
are great ideas. That's why I wanted to bring this question up, because I think if we're going to do this, we need to really do it right and make sure people have the right tools. Because it can be a daunting task.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for all that. That was great.
Thank you for
I'm sure
bringing it up.
we'll talk again.
It's like
Kendra's got a question, and then if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. If you don't know how to raise your hand, we can share that in the chat window here. Kendra?
All right, great, thanks. Thank you, Elise, for your presentation, and thank you, everyone, for your fantastic questions. As I told you on the phone, we're working together in the township to educate folks on, what wetlands are, what buffers are, help them restore it if necessary. So, Emma's, one of the big leading folks on this. She's out in the field and identifying those invasives and helping us plant natives. And we're going to have a whole bunch of demonstration areas, hopefully throughout the township, and have property owners join in on that. But so I'm really grateful for that. The one thing I wanted to say about herbiciding the whole thing, I mean, we can't, part of our ordinance is not, we can't have chemicals in the 20-foot natural vegetation buffer. Although with safe ways of doing it and removing invasive species, I'm hoping that's what you were referring to in relationship to that end of things. So I just wanted to check in with you to make sure that's what you're referring to.
When I was said to herbicide it, there are other approaches to herbiciding, but it is helpful to kill what's there, so you have a clean slate to start a natural buffer that's really so you're not fighting the existing vegetation. I suppose there's a spectrum of how you could approach this. One would be augmenting what's currently there with native plants. That's probably a much more realistic approach to take. But if you wanted to do just a complete conversion and do seed, and with seed, it's best to have bare soil, then you have the total blitz approach. But that may not be the best idea for community work. So it's probably the type of thing where it depends on the individual situation. One thing we ran into when I worked with that one homeowner to improve their buffer is there were quite a few invasive shrubs that were there already, and you don't want to keep those growing there. So I was like, it's okay to dig these out, but people don't even know what are invasive shrubs. What's the good stuff, what's the bad stuff. So public education in that regard, I think, is also valuable. I think the ordinance is just says 20 feet of like natural, like I think the idea is that it's undeveloped so that it's not the turf up to the wetland edge. But sometimes the stuff that is in that kind of natural area may not be the best stuff to be growing, you know, like black locust or honeysuckle or that type of thing. But that, you know, I don't know, you might want to pick your battles. It's
Well,
best
true.
to,
I think that, sorry. So Emma, I don't know if you're familiar with Emma, but Emma, you know, trains on removing invasives, for example, like a cut stump method of removing a
Yeah.
shrubby. So that you just put a little bit on the stump of it, as opposed to putting chemicals
Yeah.
all in that natural, because that's against the ordinance to do that. So you have to do it in safe kinds of ways. But we're also building up to, you know, a native plant sale that we have here at our Harris Nature Center. So there'll be a lot of plugs that people can put in. So it's going to be a combination of removing invasives, but also planting those natives. And there's other methods that, you know, of removing, controlled different kinds of things like that. So I just wanted to clarify that for the audience.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I have to, I'm used to like big development projects, you know, where they're going in and they're grading the whole site. And I have to switch my brain over to the homeowner, and, you know, that's a different kind of scenario. So I had, so you're right. That would be a better approach.
Emma.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add a thought too, and I think coming from both what Elise is saying and Kendra's saying, we definitely, you know, don't want to be encouraging residents to use herbicide on their own near a wetland. But let's say their buffer is mostly reed canary grass leading into upland. That's going to be really, really difficult to remove. I mean, I've tried digging out reed canary grass. And so I'm always an advocate too of teaching people, you know, I'm always happy to volunteer to come out. I am a certified pesticide applicator. There are responsible ways to do it. So I totally agree. I don't think we want people going out and spraying herbicide. That's against the ordinance, but I do always like to take the educational moment to teach them when it is proper and how it can be properly done too. And if anybody does ever have questions on that, I think my number is listed on the brochure for pesticide use. So
I love the idea of a class, Elise, you mentioned, and Emma's been doing quite a bit of that, but teaching people how to identify their buffers, their wetland, if they have it in their yard. Just that seems like the educational approach that we're looking for. And then if we have some people on staff that are trained, or volunteers that are trained, that could be resource people for those people that need a little extra help. So maybe you and Emma can get together and do a class.
I'm game.
How about some of you who haven't had a question? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and shout it out if you've got something. Appreciate the dialogue here.
The 5-year monitoring that goes on after a mitigation effort, is that up to the developer to monitor and create the reports, or is there some kind of a ground truthing that the township does?
Yeah, totally. So the developer hires a wetland professional to do the monitoring. And then when that monitoring report comes in, it's sent over to me, and then I go do the ground truthing to make sure that it's consistent. I mean, vast majority of the time it is. The one problem I've run in the past is they did not collect enough data to really support their view that it's being successful. And they, you know, on a rare occasion, they try and gloss over the problems that they might have. And so then I, you know, come in and say, hey, no, this is what I saw. This is an issue. How are you, you know, you need to do this, or how are you going to improve the situation? So, so both things happen. They don't. I don't think the developer always hires someone though who is specialized in this area. They don't try and do it themselves.
The drain commissioner popped in last month and mentioned something, the idea of a bubble buffer. Have you heard of that concept?
No, I hadn't. Someone mentioned that in an email when we were setting today's meeting up, and I had actually never heard of that concept, so I can't really comment on it. Yeah.
He might have just been blowing bubbles. Other questions? We have about 15 more minutes. Courtney, Trustee Wazinski's here. Thank you,
Yeah.
Trustee, for being a champion of our wetlands.
Yes, important work. Thank you. Thank you, Elise. That was very informative. I couldn't keep up with notes, so I hope Emma took them. Most of them. I have two questions that have been posed to me at the board level. One of them refers, you referred to the 4 different types of wetlands. And I've heard some folks say, well, that's just this type of wetland, so that's not important. Would you agree or disagree that any one of those 4 types would be either more important than the others or less important?
Are you talking about the difference between emergent, scrub, shrub, forested, that type of thing?
Yeah.
Well, they're all equally regulated under the ordinance and under state law. Yeah, and actually the big question there too is something that I've kind of thought about for many years, that we do regulate all wetlands the same, and yet I go out and, some wetlands to me are such high quality. They're so diverse. I see plants I don't see very often. And then other wetlands, it's just a massive reed canary grass. They're just getting dirty stormwater. They're still performing functions though, and those are valuable. So as far as regulations go, they don't really differentiate value that much, differences in value between the different ones. The one thing where I do see a difference in the way it's treated, well, actually there's a couple ways. The mitigation for forested wetlands is at a higher ratio. So if you impact an acre of a forested wetland, you have to create 2 acres of new forested wetland because they are more highly valued. They're harder they're harder to recreate, to create new forested wetland. It takes a long time. You got to get the hydrology just right. Otherwise you drown the trees or you end up with upland. The other way that I see value, a consideration of wetland value is in the state law. There is if the wetland doesn't fit some of the main criteria for being regulated, like being greater than 5 acres in size or being contiguous to a body of water, it could still be regulated if the state deems it as a rare or imperiled wetland. So there is a list of rare and imperiled wetlands that no matter the size, maybe they could be regulated by the state. Offhand, I actually don't remember if that is also in the wetland ordinance or not. And it's very uncommon to come across these rare and imperiled wetlands. But that's, because there just really aren't that many of them. So, but mostly wetlands are all just kind of viewed the same as far as the regulations go, even though they may vary a lot as far as quality go and the diversity of their function.
Thank you. That's super helpful. The other question that has arose was, I've heard like, well, this wouldn't have been a wetland if this didn't happen. So it's a redirection of surface water, and now is quite honestly under the ordinance a regulated wetland. How would you, how do you have any insight into that on how we should respond?
tough. That's the way it goes. Yeah, I mean, that is, the state runs into that. You guys run into that. It does not matter if it historically was a wetland. If it's a wetland now, and if it fits the criteria for being a regulated wetland, then it's a regulated wetland. Now, there are certain exemptions where wetlands are not regulated, so you always have to double check to make sure that the particular it doesn't fit into one of those situations, like, historic farming is allowed in wetlands, and forestry, and there are certain things you can do in wetlands and you don't need a permit, but it is not uncommon that a wetland forms, especially if you have clay soil, because stormwater was redirected. Now, stormwater management facilities are not regulated wetlands. So if it's a designated stormwater detention basin, then it wouldn't be regulated, but you could still have water being sent to a low area that's not a stormwater basin. It becomes a wetland. Now it is regulated. And I know that's annoying to people, but that is the way the law is set up. So
Thank you.
I don't envy you having to deal with those situations.
Bill?
Yeah, I was already going to ask about detention basins. We did chat a little bit with the drain commissioner on that topic, and it seems that his office is getting very active and creative in building these detention basins. In my experience, for the most part, they're just planted in grasses and mowed. And he seemed open to the idea that some number of those detention basins could provide more services than just the stormwater retention. And I'm curious if you have had any experience with taking kind of a standard mowed basin and planting in it and having success in that way in enlarging wetlands.
Yeah. I work with the water resources team at Fishbeck, which is the team of engineers that does a lot of detention basin design, and we also work together when we do wetland design for certain projects. And we do have different hybrids of along those lines. It depends on the hydrology, and I'm not an engineer, but I know that some basins are designed to be dry, I think, so and then some are designed to be more wet, and it is true that they are often just seeded with grass that's mowed. A lot of times they're not. And we do sometimes use a native mix that is kind of formulated for detention basins, because that water can be dirty. It can come off of parking lots and have other stuff in it. So you want plants that are kind of tough. And it can also handle dry and wet conditions. So the one kind of drawback, and it maybe depends on the type of basin, but you always have to keep in mind the required maintenance for the basin. So if you're going to get a lot of sediment kind of falling out of the water, eventually may need to dig out the basin. That'll disrupt the plants. You do not want trees or woody plants in a basin. I know that. So they have to kind of look at it kind of big picture, like what would work for this situation. But I do think that there is a place for native plants in those basins, and they have deeper roots, so they could improve infiltration, which is often, what you want in a basin is for it to infiltrate and draw down, and not just sit there and be stagnant water until it overflows. So, yeah.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is, if people think of other questions, would you be willing to respond to a couple emails, or if they come in the next day or two, just follow-up questions, Elise?
Sure, that'd be fine. Yep.
Oh, thank you so much.
Share my email.
Um,
Yeah, no, I do. One thing I do need to, as far as specific situations, that the way my relationship with Meridian Township is that any specific concerns about property goes to the office of, I always forget what that
Planning director. The planning director.
Community Planning and Development. I don't know why I can't get that in my head, but yeah, that's where questions regarding specific property should be directed. And then Tim and his staff reach out to me as needed for support. What Mark Hisselbach set it up this way years ago, because it's to have the proper chain of communication, and also as far as specific sites go, time is money. I typically bill my time to the township, and so they can handle a lot of these questions, and then I'm not billing them for doing that when they can handle it. So that's probably way beyond like what you're talking about. But
thank you for clarifying. That's helpful.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your hour here today. One other, but just on a related note, if you have suggestions of communities or projects that you think might be good models or referrals for us, if you could send them to us just to look into, or people to talk to, we're interested in other success stories as we move forward here with this campaign.
I know there are. I don't know how many other townships or cities have wetland ordinances. They're fairly common in the Detroit area. Novi, I know, has one, plus a tree ordinance, and a lot of really good. They have a great website. If you ever check out City of Novi, they have a lot of online resources for their residents. That one just pops up in my mind. Probably City of Ann Arbor too. I'm not as familiar with them, but obviously Meridian is where I've focused most of my energy. But we do run into other cities as we do our other Fishbeck work.
Okay.
So I'll keep that in mind. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we have time for a couple quick questions. Go ahead, Sarah.
Mine's real quick. So if I'm going to put a buffer zone by this pond, do I need to get approval, or do I need to go through the township to do this?
So you're talking the 20 feet out from the wetland boundary? No, I don't think so. No.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bruce?
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's more of an observation. The work that's going to be done on Grand River, the township, I think, acquired this property, but now it's listed under the drain commissioner as ownership. There's a house across from Playmakers that is, I think, in the next 2 weeks they're going to be demolishing that house and removing the foundation in order to help. There's a little wetland right next door to it, which is been causing problems with the sidewalk and road subsidization there. I'm wondering if that would be an opportunity for restoring a little bit of a wetland area, and also an educational opportunity for the township. Just an idea.
Great suggestion. Thank you, Bruce. If anybody has any thoughts on that or parting comments, I want to thank everyone for this intense hour, and also encourage you to mark your calendar for next week. Same link, 9 o'clock. We will have a one of our people here today, John Sarver, will be leading another presentation on March 2nd to talk about solarized meridian. So put that on your calendar as well. I think Bill had one final, we'll give Bill the final word because, Bill invited you today. He suggested that we have you. So thank you, Bill, for that great suggestion. If you have suggestions for other speakers, feel free to pipe in. And yeah, thank you, Elise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really interesting, and I've enjoyed our discussion. I don't know if I'm caught up on all the chat, but anyway, thank you for your support.
Thanks, everybody, and appreciate everyone being here.
Everyone.
We'll
Thanks,
see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. Appreciate
Yep,
it.
take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Happy World Wetland Day.
Yeah.